Good evening, everybody. I thought I would take time while I had time and while I'm thinking about it to make another video, and pretty much back to back. I just made one not long ago, and while I've still got it in my head on a couple of things, I figure I would say a few things I forgot in the last one, and then kind of cover a couple other topics too. I thought the bullets in the background, I always thought that was a cool setup, so give y'all something to look at. Why yak? In the last video, I was talking about how it bugged me to see a lot of propaganda and a bunch of false information floating around on the internet, and just in general, just out and about. And I was talking about how much I thought it was stupid to pit one caliber and against another one and then go through a bunch of stuff and deem the one as ineffective or bad or whatever it may be. And that's just 90% of the time, that's just not the case. I will agree that, there's some cartridges that are not adequate for what somebody's trying to do, whatever that intended purpose may be. That is true, but to just call a cartridge just completely useless or ineffective or, it sucks, that's just not the case, because it might not be a good thing at one objective. It might not be good for certain things, but I can guarantee that it's going to be good and will be very useful for another topic. And I touched on the 45 versus the 9mm thing. That seems to be the craze here the last several years, and to me that's so stupid, because you've got a big bore cartridge versus a semi medium bore cartridge, and two cartridges that are very, very different, but they're both very common, and they're both commonly used for the same purpose. And they get in a boxing match all too often, and in reality, they are not a comparable cartridge. But people do things, and they fix things, and that's something else that I'd forgotten to talk about in the last video, was when you make numbers cross. And you can play with cartridges quite there's a lot you can do with a cartridge, whether you're playing with the bullet weight, the bullet style, your powder, what type of powder, how much powder, your precision of the brass primer used. There's lots of factors that you can play and play and play, and you can really sit down and refine stuff and tweak stuff until you get it where you want it. Or if you're just experimenting, then that's the cool thing about reloading. But as it is, even if you have a cartridge that is bigger in diameter and has more case capacity, there is always something you can do to make it cross numbers with other cartridges. And that's a lot of what you see with a lot of these alleged tests that people do. And sometimes you'll see cartridges that are several sizes up in what we call caliber, and they will be equal or slightly less or slightly more, just whatever, to several size caliber smaller. And what the majority of people do not understand is just because you test one bullet type from one manufacturer with a certain type of powder, and you do one test scenario against another one and the one outperforms it, does not necessarily mean it is a superior, because that seems the word that they like to use, superior cartridge to the other. Because people that understand this, people that reload, people that really understand ballistics, they understand that one cartridge has a wide to a narrow, normally on the wider side. When I say narrow, I'm pretty much talking about very old cartridges that are not produced anymore, cartridges that are barely hanging on. They still produce them, but they only make a couple different factory loadings, and people never really experimented that much with them. And there's not a lot to be done. And then you have other cartridges that have such a wide range, you about have to have a book to keep up with all the possibilities. Okay, a good example would be the 38 Special here. It's still today a staple in the handgun world. It's that cartridge was designed in the late 1890s, and it is still widely used, widely shot, and widely loved by a lot. And this cartridge has a very wide range of performance. The standard weight projectile for this cartridge is 158 grains. You can go down under 100 grains. You can go up to 200 grains. That's a very wide range of projectile. And this little cartridge can be pushed to very modest, very low speeds. I mean, you can get this thing shooting around 700 feet per second. Or you can hot rod that thing if you have a firearm that is capable of holding the pressure up to 1,200 feet per second. That's a very wide range of performance. And again, you got to watch what you do with this cartridge, because it's old enough that it was chambered in firearms that are not capable of handling modern pressure and not capable of handling those really hot loads. So you got to watch your firearms when you're talking about 38 Smith & Wesson Special. There is also a 38 Long Colt. They still manufacture ammo for it, and it's older than this cartridge, and it is significantly weaker than this cartridge, and it does not have as many loadings. It's not out there. There's not a demand, and it is well known in history that 38 Smith & Wesson Special is a lot more effective than the old 38 Long Colt was. 357 Magnum is the same way. Very wide range. Of course, this cartridge was from the 38 Special. They extended the case. It's made to a lot higher pressure. And again, it has that wide range of powder possibilities, the bullet weight range. Again, the standard for this as well is 158 grain, although sometimes it seems like 125 grain is, because it's pretty much as common. Again, you can go down to around 100 grains with this, or you can push it all the way to 200. You've got speeds. A really weak 357 Magnum is going to be around, I'm going to say, the upper 1,000 range, and I mean that's a powder puff load. 90% of the 357 Magnum rounds you're going to see is going to at least be 1,200 feet a second, but 1,200 feet a second's about standard par. And you can play with that baby, and you can push, and I'm talking about in handgun length barrels. You can push 357 Magnum to 1,700 feet a second. It's not really that hard. So, again, a lot of capability, a lot of versatility. And of course, these two cartridges interchange. One direction. 357 Magnum doubles for 38 Special, but not the other way around. Most of you will know that. And that's the beautiful thing about revolver cartridges, because 90% of the time, again, that's usually the way it is. 32 Smith & Wesson long. You can shoot the old 32 Smith & Wesson, what some people call 32 short. And the 32 cals, they just keep stair-stepping. It seems like the 32 cals and the 45 cals seem to be like that in revolver lines, being the top tier 32 caliber would be 327 Federal Magnum. And if you have a 327 revolver, you can use all of the predecessor 32 caliber cartridges. If you have a 327, you can also shoot 32 H&R Magnum, 32 Smith & Wesson long, and 32 Smith & Wesson or short. You can shoot them all. Very versatile, a lot of options. You can go full-blown barn burner, or you can go a little powder puff blank. It's whatever you want. The same way with the 45 calibers. The 45 Colt stands by itself because, it was pretty much the first of its kind in the metallic cartridge range. The 45 Schofield round for the Smith & Wesson top break revolvers is shorter and is not quite as potent as the Colt round. And then when you start getting into more modern 45 ACP will fit in 45 Colt chamber, of course, but of course you could run into problems because it's not a rimmed cartridge unless you're using clips. And then jump up to 40 years ago with the conception of, well, commercially, it's actually a lot older than that, but the commercially introduction of the 454 Casull round, which is 454 diameter, 45 caliber. And then even to more modern times, the 460 Smith & Wesson Magnum, which, despite the name, it is 45 caliber. So if you have a 460 Smith, you can shoot 454 Casull. You can shoot 45 Colt. You can shoot 45 Schofield. And, if you wanted to go through the trouble, you could shoot 45 Auto, 45 Super, whatever. Just, you know what I'm saying. Very, very versatile. Well, auto-loading handguns don't really have that advantage in cartridge versatility. When you have an automatic handgun that it's chambered in, it's that caliber. That's it. You'll see some nuts that will take something like 40 Smith & Wesson and try to shoot it in a 10 millimeter, and usually it won't blow them up. It's not good for the gun. It's not a good idea. It can work, but it's not a good idea. But for the most part, that's not a good idea. That is really not a good idea. If you got an automatic handgun, it's unless it's modified to do so, it is a 1 caliber chambering. So, another thing I wanted to touch on that I forgot on the last video is the hype and the trend of dumping one cartridge for another when there's really not that big of a difference as a whole. And before you buy into something that somebody's telling you, think about the facts here, not about what somebody behind a counter is trying to push, or what somebody that don't know what they're talking about is telling you. Here's a good example. 40 Smith & Wesson and 10 millimeter are very popular 40 caliber handgun rounds. Well, you know, again, the same way with several of the cartridges that I've already mentioned, 40 Smith & Wesson was derived from 10 millimeter. It is a 10 millimeter with a shortened case. You know, it's not a big deal. There's a few minor differences in the case, but again, we're not going to get that technical. Well, in its standard loadings, 40 Smith is not as potent as 10 millimeter. And this is true. And I'm talking about just like your range ammo. When I say standard ammo, I'm just talking about common, plink, range, full metal jacket, whatever. I'm talking about standard ammo. You know, if you're shooting a 165 grain 40 Smith & Wesson or a 180 grain 40 Smith & Wesson, 180 grain 10 millimeter, yeah, the 10 millimeter is going to be, it's got more horsepower, faster velocities, pretty much the same bullet, but it's going to be moving faster. Now, is it that much faster for you to hear somebody say, oh, the 40 Smith & Wesson sucks, the 40 Smith & Wesson's outdated, and this and yada, yada, yada? Okay, I know several dudes that has got rid of their 40 Smiths, and they're wanting a 10 millimeter because of all the stuff they've heard people tell them. Well, yes, it is 100% true that 10 millimeter is more powerful than 40 Smith. And on the top end, again, it's still more powerful than the 40. But if you're not talking about shooting the most powerful loadings that you can get in that caliber, and when I say that, I'm pretty much talking about the 200 grain or bigger defensive loads that they make for dangerous game, or maybe an extreme hot hunting load. Because again, both of those calibers was designed for a man stopper and or / law enforcement use. So most of the time, both of those calibers are used for two-legged predators. Even though that it seems like 10 is really gaining ground with the outdoorsman. 40 Smith & Wesson can get right at 10 millimeter power levels on the standard scale. The same way with 38 Special can be loaded to a standard 357. You got a 357 Magnum, standard load, 158 grain. That thing's moving around 1160, 1200 feet a second. You can load 38 Special in what would be known as a plus P load with the same weight projectile to be right at that or just barely under that speed. You can load the 38 Special to a kicking 1200 feet per second mark, but 1100 dependably. So when you start to really hot rod 357, no, you're never going to catch it with 38 Special. But if you're talking about the guy that doesn't own a 357, but he owns a 38, and he wants to get the maximum power potential that he can hit the performance standard of the bigger, more powerful cartridge. And that's the same way with 40 Smith & Wesson. You can buy 40 Smith & Wesson, may it be a plus P round, and it will be right at that level of 10 millimeter performance. You can push the same bullet. It is literally the same bullet right at that 1200 feet per second mark. And if the guy doesn't have a 10 millimeter, doesn't have the cash for a 10 millimeter, but he really wants to have that power level, but he has a 40 Smith & Wesson, well, guess what? You can make that 40 really, really scream. and it's not going to surpass the power level, but in a lot of cases, you can match it. And again, the same bullet. I mean, you can match any bullet you can get for a 10 millimeter, you can get for a 40. So I don't understand all the hate that 40 Smith & Wesson has caught the last couple years, because there is absolutely no reason for it. You know, growing up and for a lot of my life, 40 Smith & Wesson was where it was at. I mean, the law carried it. A lot of people had. My dad had one. Both my uncles had one. I mean, I know a lot of people that had a 40 Smith & Wesson, whether it was a Glock or Smith & Wesson MP. And it all, you know, we had absolutely no complaints. The cartridge always performed good. We enjoyed shooting them. Never had any flack. And, you know, I've got family that's in law enforcement, and they felt perfectly fine. They never once felt undergunned by anybody. And I don't understand it. And then here recently, with the resurgence of the popularity of 10 millimeter, here we go. Everybody's crapping on the 40 Smith & Wesson, and there's no reason for that, guys. I don't understand it. 40 Smith & Wesson is just as awesome a cartridge as 10 millimeter is. And again, it was derived from it. It's basically the same cartridge, just shortened. So I don't know. I don't get all this love-hate junk. It's ridiculous. And cartridges go through phases, you know, because we have cartridges that are still in production and firearms that are chambered in those cartridges still in production that have a lot of age on them. And all the years in between, they have stayed popular because they're a good performer. But there's also word of mouth and hype and overratedness to certain cartridges, because some of them have not stayed in production for over 100 years because they are a fantastic performer. 4570 here would be a good example of that. Again, that cartridge has been around since 1870. They still produce this cartridge. They make lots of different bullets for it. They make lots of, the weight range is insane. I mean, you're looking at like a 250 grain projectile, and you can actually push it over 500 if you wish to. That's on the upper end stretch, but again, they make them. And power levels is insane because, again, this cartridge is old enough to where it goes back to the black powder days. So the old designation of cartridges was very simple, but some people don't understand them because, again, we're talking about vintage stuff here. 45-70. Your first two digits is your caliber. That's your bullet diameter. So it's a 45 caliber bullet. The last two digits is your grainage, your loading of powder. So 45 caliber bullet, 70 grains of powder. Now that's black powder. You're not going to load 70 grains of modern powder in this. That's not going to be a good thing. I mean, you're absolutely pushing the limits. But a really hot 45-70, you load 60, 61 grains, and I mean, that's a barn burner. That's a hot load. So you are looking at this cartridge, again, wide range of bullets, and you're talking about a velocity span of anywhere to, I mean, low speeds by today's standards. I mean, the original loading for this, for the Springfield rifles, you're looking at you're looking at a 405 grain projectile, a lead projectile, just the old lead, round nose, semi-flat nose, with black powder. And that 405 grain load is only moving at like 1,200 feet a second. You know, I mean, that's a good hot handgun load today. Not that impressive, but you can't underestimate that because that's still a very capable cartridge in that form. People don't realize this about black powder cartridges, but just because they're moving slow does not mean that they don't perform. This 45 caliber conical bullet, a quick story. When I was a teenager is when I first discovered the real world of black powder firearms, and I fell in love with percussion revolvers from, the mid 1800s. You're looking from 1836 all the way up to right at 1870, and I fell in love with them. They're so fun to shoot. It's a wonderful hobby, and by today's standards, they don't stand out, but these are wonderful performing firearms, especially for their time. Because you're talking about the pioneering of what we now know as the modern handgun. Because you're pretty much talking about the original repeating handguns. Revolvers were the first mainstream working repeating handguns. You go from one round to 5 or 6. That was a big deal back then. And for as primitive as we see them today, they were wonderful performers, because you're taking this soft lead projectiles, which you can also, I've actually hard casted some of these before, and let me tell you, they penetrate like you would not believe. And again, you're looking at numbers. I'm not a formula guy. I am not a formula guy, because this bullet in an 8-inch revolver will penetrate far, far past 18 inches. And I'm talking at modest velocities. It doesn't really take that much speed to get it going. That's what people don't understand. That's the reason why the 45 ACP there will do just as an effective job at stopping dangerous threats via dangerous animals as the 10 millimeter will, because while it's true that 10 will penetrate deeper, 45 penetrates not a whole lot less, with a lot less speed behind it. And that's the same way with these, because you're talking, that's a 200 grain projectile, and that is being pushed honestly 900 feet per second would be pushing it. I'm going to lean closer to the 830. And the first time I tested that myself, I put up a water jug. No, 2 water jugs. I put up 2 1-gallon water jugs, and we had a project, and they were like, I don't know, they were like 10 by 7 squares of plywood, just half-inch plywood. And I had 7 of those boards, and I leaned them up against each other. And what my intentions was to catch this projectile, because I wanted to see how it was performing, because I had cast, when I first bought the mold for this, I cast it with really fine, pure, soft lead, and I wanted to see what kind of performance I was getting out of that pistol. So I was in an attempt to catch this projectile. So again, 2 water jugs, 7 pieces of half-inch plywood, plus my prop for all this was a steel house door that we had removed from an update, and it made a perfect stand against the tree for paper targets. So it was a good rest to put all this up against. And by golly, when I pulled the trigger, I made a good shot, hit the jugs dead center. Well, guess what? It went through both of the jugs, all 7 pieces of plywood, through the door, and kept on trucking into the dirt bank. I didn't catch the projectile. These perform unreal for their age, for their design, and for the speeds that they're pushed at. Do not underestimate black powder firearms. A lot of people do. They look at it, they act like it's an ancient medieval derringer or a dagger or something. But don't ever forget that, again, these were the pioneers of what we know as the modern handgun. And don't ever forget that caliber projectile of this similar design, boys, this put a lot of people in the ground over 100 years ago. They fought a couple wars with these before they got phased out. People migrated west with these things. They hunted with them. Very, very effective. There ain't nobody can sit here and say that cartridge is not, or that projectile is not effective. I've done some hunting with that myself. That's actually why I bought that bullet mold, is to hunt with these. And I've killed several deer with that projectile, and it does a fine job. And I can tell you, they don't go too far. I did manage to hit one in the spine once, and it just dropped instantly. And let me tell you something. That bullet right there, if you, as close as I was, it actually, the black powder, is wicked looking. The black powder singed the hairs on the entry hole where I was so close, and it literally pulled the hide in the entry hole as it went through, and as it hit the spine, it absolutely just shrapneled the bone. It's unreal. And of course, it easily penetrated and went out the other side. But just the damage for just an old, simple design is amazingly effective. So that's another thing I wanted to touch on about this is, don't underestimate, don't disregard, and don't fall into all these stupid trends and hypes and stuff, because, again, I don't understand why these people do this stuff. I don't know if they're getting money off marketing or whatever they may be doing, but 40 Smith & Wesson doesn't suck. 9mm doesn't suck. 45 ACP doesn't suck. 38 Special doesn't suck. Black powder, while, yeah, I mean, it's kind of outdated, I guess you could say, but it's still today very effective. Very effective. Is it practical? Well, no, but very effective. Don't underestimate them. They are still today a fine hunting tool, and they are very fun to have as a hobby. If you enjoy shooting and you don't care to get a little dirty because there's mess involved, it's very, very fun. It's a fun hobby. And I just, that's kind of what I had on my mind, guys, and I want to clarify that. And I just want to give people, maybe you didn't think about some of the points I've talked about, is, leave a comment if there's something that I forgot or something I've missed, bring to my attention. Comment if you like this kind of stuff. Give me a like. I know I'm an old redneck and I ain't got a college degree speech, but I have real life experiences and I enjoy doing this as a hobby, and I like facts, guys. I'm all about the real world scenario. I don't care nothing about what somebody wrote down on a piece of paper, because, again, just because one cartridge outperforms to another does not mean that the losing cartridge is ineffective, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its place and purpose. And also, but sorry, I had to take care of something real quick. And then another thing that I mentioned in the other video was how in the handgun world, some people tend to forget that handguns are far, far below the performance of rifle cartridges. And you got some people out there that they've got people thinking that we've got handguns that have the power of a daggone 30-06, and that's not the case. We have some very, very impressive handgun cartridges. It's 2025. We've come a long way since, boy, I don't even know, 1,500, whatever it may be. We've come a long way, and we have some very impressive handgun cartridges these days. But, be as it may, the most powerful handgun cartridge known to man is still, I mean, I hate to say weak, but they're pretty much pitiful compared to a lot of rifle rounds. So when these people act like these different calibers and these handguns and this and that and other, anytime you have the choice, when you're talking about raw firepower, you go straight to a rifle. You're not going to grab for a handgun. Handguns are called sidearms for a reason. They're backup. They're self-defense. You know, don't get me wrong. I'm a handgun hunter. I like to keep it within its boundaries, and I love the challenge of it. But in all practicality, handgun is what you grab when everything else is expended. You know, the same as in the military. You don't grab your handgun and just go charging into the front line battle. That's not the way it works. Rifles are far superior if you're talking about power. There again, I'll use one of their favorite words. This is superior. Rifles are superior to handguns in all cases. That's just the way it is. Even if it's a bigger diameter bullet in the handgun, you know, here's 45. I put that over here to this 30 cal. It's way bigger. It's a bigger bullet. It doesn't matter. It ain't got near the thump as that 7.62 54. Not near. So I mentioned in my last video that revolver cartridges is always going to be more powerful than the comparable auto-loading cartridge is. And I mentioned in there that is always the case, with the exception of a select couple. And one of the couples, off the top of my head, that I know that to be true, to where the auto-loading cartridge is actually more powerful than the comparable revolver cartridge, would be the 32 ACP versus the 32 Smith & Wesson, some call short, and then the 32 Smith & Wesson long. The 32 ACP is more powerful than the 32 Smith by a margin, and it does edge out the 32 long, even though 32 long is pretty much on par with it. But the 32 ACP can edge it out, and I'm talking it's very, very barely, but it just enough can edge out the power of 32 long. So that is an exception. And of course, they do make some very impressive non-streamlined autoloader cartridges, the same as they do with revolvers. If you're talking about the 45 there, you have 45 Super, 460 Roland. Those are very impressive cartridges. But again, if you're comparing apples to apples, when you start talking about experimental, non-streamlined revolver cartridges, again, you're going to get edged out. There's nothing you can do. The most powerful handgun has always been, and to this point is, and probably always will be, minus to maybe some sort of weird single shot that could handle anything. Because technically you could come back and say, well, the most powerful handgun in the world is that single shot Thompson hunting pistol that I bought, and it's chambered in 30-30, or it's chambered in 45-70, and you're like, okay, well, yeah, but we're talking about handgun designed cartridges. We're not talking about putting a rifle cartridges in a handgun sized firearm. That's not what we're talking about here. But the most powerful handgun in the world has been held by a revolver since 1847. because the old Colt Walker 44 held that title actually longer than any of them to this day. 500 Smith is holding on to the title. It's going on a long time as far as production handguns, but the Colt Walker held that title of most powerful handgun from 1847 all the way to 1935. So it held the title the longest. The 357 held it for 20 years. The 44 Magnum held it for about, well, a little bit over 20 years. And then the 454 Casull held it for around 20 years. And then the 500 Smith mag has held it since 2003, and it's still holding it today. So if you're talking about the ultimate in power and handguns, you got to go with a revolver. That's it. It's good that you can get more powerful rounds in autoloaders than just your standard stuff, but at the same time, revolvers are always going to be your better choice when you're talking about ultimate all-out power. And then again, you're also talking about autoloaders. There's always a more susceptible chance for failure with an autoloader compared to a revolver. Neither is perfect, but history has proven time and time again revolvers are more reliable than autoloaders. And the higher you push that power level in automatics, the worse it tends to get, because when you start really romping on those springs, and the bullet design makes a big difference, and a lot of the automatics just cannot handle the abuse of really hot cartridges, really hot loads. They can't. It batters them to death. Not saying that you can't batter a revolver either, but it's much more easier to make a revolver hold up to heavy abuse than it is an automatic. It doesn't take not near as much work. And, push goes to shove. Whenever you need that and you rely on that trigger pull, you pull the trigger on a wheel gun, unless just some freak accident, say, it's going to break apart and it locks up on you, that's a freak accident, and that could happen to anything mechanical. Anything mechanical can failure, but an autoloader, they've got a lot more moving parts as far as like inertia moving parts. Yeah, technically, I guess wheel guns have more internal moving parts, but again, just the way that automatic, it's the nature of the beast. They can fail, and any of them can fail. I don't care. You'll hear people say, well, Glocks never jam. That's not true. That is 100% not true. If you ain't got one to jam, you ain't shot enough of them. You've not shot enough rounds through the gun to get it to jam, or you've not shot their different models. The Glock can jam just as easy as everything else can, and it can happen. And there's a chance that it can happen. So you always remember, you might have shot 2,000 rounds through that thing, and it might have run like a sewing machine. But that one chance that you need it, there's a chance that it could fail for whatever may reason. And because you got to remember, there's multiple malfunctions you can have with an autoloader. There's pretty much one malfunction that you can have with a revolver, and it's not even the gun itself's fault. It's the ammunition. And that failure being the bullet creeped forward enough to actually wedge between the cylinder and the forcing cone, and it jams up the gun. And again, that ain't even the gun's fault. Automatics, you can have multiple malfunction issues, whether it be a stovepipe, failure to feed, failure to eject, blah, blah, blah. Because, I've heard people say that, oh, well, revolvers can jam, that mechanical part can fail. That's not a jam. That's a mechanical failure. That's a part broke or something come loose, and that can happen with an autoloader just as easy as it can a revolver. That's not a jam. That's a component failure. That's not the same thing. So again, just wanted to touch on that. And this one's even longer than the last video, but I wanted to make a complete coverage of what I had on my mind and to get it out. And if y'all like this kind of thing, let me know. If you like this, you think I did a halfway decent job, you know, I'm an old redneck. I ain't no college speaker. Give me a like. If you want more of this, let me know. I can do something, because again, my whole purpose of doing this is because I don't see anybody doing this on YouTube. I don't see anybody giving out this kind of information. I'm trying to give out facts. I'm trying to give out experiences, and I'm wanting to just kind of shed light on a couple things that I can't find myself. So I feel like I owed it to myself to shed light on it and maybe show a few others as well. So if you've watched all of this, if you've watched both of these last two videos, thank you. And I'll try to get more stuff out. If you want more stuff, give me a request. I'll see if I can do it. Y'all have a good one now.